and welcome to the Biblical Justice A2X video series. Each month, Global Justice is pleased to present this video series to cover a range of key justice issues from a biblical and ethical perspective. This month, we'll be featuring the topic of criminal justice. My name is Sosma Samuel Burnett, and I serve as the founder and president of Global Justice, and I'd like to welcome you to today's series. In addition, I'd like to welcome the audience that's live today and ask that you close your other computer programs for the best audiovisual experience. Throughout the broadcast, you have the opportunity to join with us with any questions or comments you may have by just entering it into the chat box on your screen. We'll try to respond to those questions as we go throughout the program or after the program. Now, joining us today for this topic of criminal justice, we have two tremendous criminal justice experts, and I'd like to welcome them both. First, John Cotsirilos. Welcome, John.
Thank you. Good evening.
And we also want to welcome Patrick Oliver. Welcome, Patrick.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to take a moment, gentlemen, just to introduce you both before we get into our questions. So let me start with John Cotsirilos. So John is a nationally recognized defense lawyer whose expertise is in the area of the death penalty. He's been the Riverside Public Defender's Office for a number of years, and thereafter has worked in private practice. In addition, he has served as an instructor for a legal seminar on the death penalty at the University of San Diego School of Law. He has been the past president of the California Attorneys for Criminal Justice and has been the recipient of the E. Stanley Conant Award from the Defenders Program of San Diego. He's been acknowledged year after year for his legal work, both in terms of the National Best Lawyers in America list, as well as Best Lawyers in San Diego and Southern California, as well as Best Law Firms. So with those credentials, we are so pleased to have you with us again, John. Thank you.
Thank you.
In addition, Patrick Oliver. Patrick holds a PhD in leadership and change and also serves with a master's degree in business administration. Both of those apply to his current role as director of the criminal justice program at Cedarville University in Ohio. Prior to his work as a faculty member, he has served as a chief of police. He's been involved with the International Association of Chiefs of Police. In addition, has been the past president of the Ohio Association of Chiefs of Police. So again, with those credentials also, we thank you, Patrick, for joining us.
You're welcome.
Well, gentlemen, let's go ahead and get started right away with our questions. So we want to start with this topic of criminal justice and really just frame it for our audience. I'm going to start with you, John. Tell us a little bit about this topic. What are some key facts, figures, and concepts that we need to understand about criminal justice before we get into our further questions?
Well, from my perspective as a defense attorney, I think we have, as far as the trial process here in the United States, I think we have an outstanding criminal justice system once someone actually begins the trial process, because in many countries they don't have jury trials as we have here, and a lot of the protection of individual rights that people enjoy once the trial process has begun, people enjoy great many protections here that they don't enjoy internationally. My concerns regarding our criminal justice system relates more to things that happen to people both before and after the actual trial process. And from a defense attorney standpoint, we have an extremely punitive system. Once people get sentenced here, we incarcerate more people than any other country on earth, more than 2.3 million people. And we're one of only 8 countries, usually between 5 and 8 countries, that execute more than 10 people in the world. We're one of those countries. To give you some idea of the other countries that we are members of and executing more than 10 people a year, the others are regularly China, Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and Somalia. And last year we were 5th in the number of executions in the world, and we're regularly, again, as I said, within the top 8. So my concerns regarding our criminal justice system internationally is the severity of the penalties that people face in this country as opposed to other areas of the world. And my other concerns regarding our criminal justice system obviously relates to what happens to people sometimes before, while they're being detained or arrested, We have a large number of people that are either injured or killed in that process because of the prevalence of firearms in this country, and the way police have to respond to people and detaining them because of the dangers posed by firearms on the street. So that kind of, in a summary, is how I view our criminal justice system in an international context.
Thank you, John. And Patrick, so similar question. Obviously, you bring a different viewpoint to this issue, given your law enforcement background. But tell us a little bit the same thing of, framing this issue for us, the facts and figures and concepts that you think are important for our audience to know.
First of all, I'd like to place this in a biblical context. God has created three institutions: the institution of marriage, which the family comes from, the institution of the body of Christ, which is the church, and the institution of government. The purpose of government, as articulated in 1 Peter 2:14, is to reward good and punish evil. So government is a God-ordained institution. Also, the purpose of government is articulated in Romans chapter 13, the first 7 verses, which talk about the purpose of government. And it is to punish the evildoer. It's to administer justice to those who hurt or harm others in this life, and God will judge them in the next life. It's important to understand that the principles of our Constitution are based on the Bible. In fact, the Bible is the #1 source document used to write the Constitution of the United States. So it is founded and based on biblical principles. The Constitution of the United States is based on the Declaration of Independence, which in that most quoted paragraph says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Rights not given by man, therefore cannot be taken by man. They're God-given rights. It goes on to say that the primary purpose of government is to protect those rights. And of course, we articulate those rights in the Bill of Rights. Those are civil rights, rights guaranteed by every person under the Constitution. So I'll just kind of stop there because I know we don't have a lot of time, but to set the foundation for our discussion.
Well, and perhaps that's a good place to pick up on sort of another part of this, which is, we are looking at this topic from a biblical and ethical standpoint. And so you've already started down that road to sort of talk about the framing of this topic, but tell us a little bit about this relationship that you see between the current, criminal justice issues and maybe some biblical or ethical standards that we need to be concerned about.
Well, justice can only be administered from a biblical perspective. One of the verses that our founders who wrote the Constitution, and these were 55 men who mostly are graduates of Harvard, Princeton, and Yale, institutions of higher learning that were Christ-centered, they started off with Isaiah 33:22, which basically says, God is king, God is lawgiver, and God is our judge. And so out of that comes the three branches of government: the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. Each one is separated to perform checks and balances on the other two, understanding that man is fallen, therefore man needs accountability. God can inherently hold all three branches of government, but man cannot because man is fallen. And they understood that concept from Jeremiah 17:9, which basically says, the heart of man is deceitfully wicked and beyond cure. Who can know it? So the biblical foundations are very important to administering justice. Mm-hmm. And our criminal justice system should mostly be operated by men and women who are committed followers of Jesus Christ because they understand the biblical principles of justice. And government is ultimately accountable to God.
Great. Thank you, Patrick. John, let me bring you into that same question. So you are a defense lawyer, and so you are working often with those that are accused, and often that's a difficult job, but it's one of those jobs specifically mentioned in the Constitution. So there's a high degree of importance in that role. So in that context, what do you see as biblical or ethical standards that you think are very important to apply to this issue of criminal justice?
Well, we have a separation of church and state in this country, so I don't think of my role in a religious context when I'm defending someone. I think most recently Pope Francis came to this country, and when he spoke to a joint session of Congress, emphasized his opposition to the death penalty and this country's isolation in the international community and its continued use of the death penalty. And in that sense, I think that there's a mixture of our religious and our civil attitudes towards that penalty, or a conflict between many people's religious and civil attitudes towards that penalty. I do represent, work for the Mexican consulate here in San Diego. I advise them on their criminal law matters and have represented them as a member of the Mexican Capital Legal Assistance Program.
Mm-hmm.
And they oppose the death penalty basically on religious grounds as a nation. So we have a very isolated view towards that penalty and towards the length of incarcerations that we impose on people in the context of the international community. Many countries historically have not been willing to extradite people to the United States because of our both use of the death penalty and our use of the conditions in our prison system relating to solitary confinement. So we do have we are kind of an outlier in the international community in our approach towards punishment. In the context of defending someone, my job is to defend their rights and put the state to their proof, regardless of what type of crime an individual is charged with, so that we're all protected, so our rights cannot be violated if someone's charged. So in that sense, I really have a very kind of non-religious role, or a secular role in the context of my work.
Great. Thank you, John. And maybe I can follow up with you then in terms of the international, since you've mentioned that as well. You mentioned the death penalty here in the United States and how we may be this outlier compared to many places around the world. Let's expand that a little bit. Tell us a little bit about how you see criminal justice in this nation and how you see that impacting or being impacted by the broader global community.
Well, the way I view, as I said at the beginning, the way I view criminal justice in this nation is that we're very fortunate in the very kind of elaborate protection of individual rights we have in this country. Once you're charged with an offense, if you can afford to hire a decent attorney or are lucky enough to have a decent attorney appointed to protect your rights. As I said, many countries don't provide the right to a jury trial or the right to effective counsel. And so we're very fortunate in that regard, but where our country is an outlier is in the severity with which we punish individuals once they are convicted of crimes, and particularly the disparity in which individuals are punished. The African American community, as Attorney General Holder recently told us, in the last administration receives about 20% higher penalties than the rest of the communities in the sentences they receive, and more than 40% of our death rows are occupied by blacks or African Americans, with a tremendous disparity in race of victim propelling who gets the death penalty in this country. So there are severe problems, and in my view, on the penalty application of the criminal justice system in our country. And as I said before, I think there's very severe problems in the number of particularly young black males that are shot in the course of being detained because of the prevalence of firearms and the need for police to protect themselves when in detaining someone. Police are trained to react very out of self-protection if someone gets within more than 20 feet of them and poses a potential lethal threat to them, and that, in my mind, explains many of the very tragic shootings that have received so much publicity over the last few years.
Mm-hmm. And just a quick follow-up, John. You mentioned earlier about the context of black males, but I want to expand that a little bit and ask, the criminal justice system has often been criticized in our country and other places for being disproportionately affecting certain groups of people, whether it's people who are disadvantaged economically or a particular racial group or other category. And would you speak to that a little bit, both in the context of this country, but also globally, if you can?
Really, I can only speak to in the context of this country, which is that, historically, presently, the black community does receive very severe penalties, 20% higher penalties for all types of crimes in our system. That's a big problem when you're working in the criminal justice system. Money is a big factor in the quality of defense one can afford. You see that as a private attorney and the types of resources you have to be able to defend somebody, and that continues to be a big problem in our criminal justice system. Historically, the black community has received the heavy brunt of particularly capital punishment in this country. And to give you just kind of a historical context, the death penalty was ruled unconstitutional in 1972, and before it was reinstated in 1977. And the records of people receiving death sentences between 1931 and 1972, when it was ruled unconstitutional then, showed that 60% of the people who received death sentences during that time period, and this is part of what led to being declared unconstitutional, were African American or black, while we have only about a 12% population. During those years, we still had the death penalty for rape. We don't any longer, and there were 455 people executed for rape. 405 of those people were black or African American. So historically, the black community has received very severely the brunt of the death penalty in this country, and as I said, continues to receive a disparate level of sentences for all types of crimes, and that's a continuing issue we need to try and address.
Thank you, John. I appreciate that. I also want to bring in Patrick into this part of our conversation. So Patrick, we were talking about the international context and sort of relating what's happening in criminal justice in our country to what's happening in other parts of the world. And I'd like to have you speak into that as well. And so your thoughts on that topic.
Well, let me just comment on what John was talking about. About 20 years ago, I was on the Ohio Commission on Racial Fairness. At the time, I was chief of police for the city of Cleveland, Ohio, my hometown. And that commission ran about 2 years. We had lawyers, judges, attorneys, prosecutors, law enforcement officers, civilian people, business people. And basically the question was, is there a bias against people based on their race or ethnicity? And the results of the study was absolutely there is, based on ethnicity, based on income, based on, in some cases, age. So there is a problem. The justice system is supposed to administer justice and do it fairly, and it's supposed to be based on, the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights, as I tell law enforcement officials, should be viewed as 10 handcuffs placed around you. It's to protect the rights of every individual from intrusion by the government. And so I suspect John, in a lot of his work, is trying to protect his clients when he feels that their rights have been violated by government. And so government does make mistakes, but those need to be corrected. I still probably feel we have the best justice system in the world because it was founded and based on biblical principles. And I think that part, I would argue, is not deniable.
Great. Thank you, Patrick. And just to follow up for you too, Patrick, in the context of law enforcement, you know that there has been a lot of criticism of law enforcement in recent years in particular. And obviously, globally, law enforcement, raises a number of concerns, maybe even more stark than what we see here in our country. Could you speak to that a little bit? I mean, obviously, from working with so many law enforcement officials that there are many, many that don't do violations and don't try to do something that's harmful to others. But there have been these instances of concern. So would you speak to that a little bit?
Yes, and when you take the dialogue, I think that's been started by Black Lives Matter, when you just say those words, they invoked an emotional response by just about everyone. And so it's not a zero-sum game. On one hand, I would say that there should never be any attacks against law enforcement officers. And we should support and work with our law enforcement officers, because public safety is a responsibility that's incumbent upon every citizen. It's something that police give full time and attention to. On the other hand, there at times is desperate treatment against minorities in our community. And I think we're naive to say that it doesn't happen or doesn't exist. So I've attended multiple, law enforcement conferences in the last several years, and whether I've been at the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, Ohio Association of Chiefs of Police, police chiefs are not in denial that they need to do a better job of protecting civil rights. So there is absolutely, positively some work to do. One of my perspectives is, as someone who's written about law enforcement hiring, that in a lot of these situations where there is evidence of a violation of civil rights, more than it's a case of a lack of policies and procedures or training or tactics, it's really an issue of the law enforcement officer involved in the incident in the first place. In many cases, things they're doing aren't part of law enforcement policy, they weren't trained to do, and so I think the number one thing law enforcement agencies need to do is get in people who are moral, ethical, community-oriented, service-oriented, and hire that type of person. Law enforcement tends to draw the action junkie, somebody who wants the gun, the badge, the authority, and that type of person can do a lot of damage in the profession.
Thank you, Patrick. And John, let me touch on that same sort of topic. You know, Patrick is sort of mentioning some things that we can do to help improve the circumstances in criminal justice in our country. I'd like to ask you the same type of question. You know, how are some ways that we can improve the situation in our country or in other places?
Well, I think to speak to the issue that Patrick was speaking to, I have a lot of sympathy for the situation police officers are caught in when on the street when they're detaining people, because we have such a dangerous environment in our country because of the number of firearms we have here. We have twice more firearms than we have people in the United States, and when law enforcement officers are detaining an individual, and it's often in high crime areas, which often correlate to minority communities occupying those areas, it's a volatile situation. And I've seen the training films that officers are exposed to because of the dangers they encounter on the street. And if an individual approaches them closer than 20 feet and has a deadly weapon on them, or they think he has a deadly weapon on them, they have to act immediately to protect themselves, and are taught to use force to stop that individual, fire to mass until the threat is over. And with young officers, as Patrick was describing, the type of people that might be attracted to law enforcement, there's going to be some really tragic mistakes often that occur. So a lot of it, in my view, is connected to just the prevalence of firearms that officers have to deal with, and the fact that we do have armed police on the street as opposed to many other countries where police officers are not armed because there's a different environment that they're working in. So I think I've heard there are training efforts now to try and train officers not to have to use deadly force so quickly, but that's a very difficult issue in the United States where we have such a dangerous environment, such a proliferation of firearms. And I'm not smart enough or wise enough to have an easy solution to that in a country where firearms are so readily available. On the end of an area that I think our criminal justice could be easily improved is that we waste a lot of money in futile efforts, particularly at the sentencing end of the system. I think here in California, we've spent since 1976 just seeking capital punishment more than $5 billion to achieve 13 executions, and we have the largest death row in the country here, more than 750 people. So there's been a huge public expense for a very minimal, if any, return in terms of public safety. And we have a lot of public safety needs on the street. More police officers are needed. We have money that can be sent. About half the rapes in this state are unsolved, and close to half of the homicides are. And money that's wasted in futile, kind of symbolic efforts, such as for the death penalty that's not functional, could be spent on concrete ways to make our streets safer and make our communities safer. And in those areas, I think if we had a more rational approach to punishment, we could improve our criminal justice system tremendously. And because of the disparities in the way our sentences are handed out, particularly the African American community has been decimated in many ways by the large number of ex-felons. Here in California, if you're an ex-felon, you don't have the right to vote. It's very difficult to find work. and to become a productive member of the community. So if we addressed how punishments are meted out, and the punishments to people that aren't an immediate threat to the community were lesser, and the ramifications of having a felony conviction weren't so civilly debilitating, I think that would help cure communities in our country. So I think there are some very concrete steps that could be taken to improve our system.
Great. And then Patrick, also, we've just talked about the fact that there's ways that we can improve law enforcement. There are ways that we can improve the sentencing process, and maybe even just, in terms of looking at the death penalty from a different perspective. Anything else that you would like to add in ways that we can improve our criminal justice system?
I'd like to say something that's almost never said, and it's a view that probably few hold. Being that I'm a committed follower of Jesus Christ and I teach at a Christ-centered institution of higher learning, I have a biblical worldview about this. If you took a secular criminologist, they would say the reason you have crime is because you have homelessness, poverty, poor parenting, drugs, alcoholism, lack of jobs, and that if you could fix all those social ills, that crime would go away. As a Christian, I say the reason you have crime is because man is inherently fallen, and he has a sin nature. And if you could put mankind in a perfect environment, such as the Garden of Eden, he would still sin. And the heart of the human problem is the problem of the human heart. Man needs a heart transplant and needs to know Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. So I think what we're seeing in our society is primarily a moral decline, and so we really need to get people to return to good, solid moral values, even just belonging to the religion of their choice and trying to live for God. We're just seeing a tremendous moral decay. Now, certainly there are some strategic things that law enforcement can do, like hiring the right kind of people, having good policies, having more accountability, teaching the Constitution of the United States, and having police officers understand that, disciplining officers when the situation warrants. But I think our primary issue in this country with the crime and problems we're seeing is a moral one.
Thank you for that, Patrick. And then, John, one more follow-up, just in the area of the costs of the criminal justice system. We've mentioned the impacts of those costs, whether it's the costs financially or in terms of the human impact once someone is convicted. Can we talk a little bit more about what that looks like in our country and otherwise, just in terms of the expense, and what is it that we need to be concerned about as citizens in terms of improving this criminal justice system?
Well, I think I've already spoken to that to some degree. Because we incarcerate so many people, and again, we incarcerate more people both in gross numbers and per capita than any other country on earth, we pay a huge amount of cost for the incarceration of those individuals. And actually, Attorney General Holder and later Attorney General Lynch and President Obama were trying to address those issues by giving out directives to lower the sentences in federal court, which is a small number of the people incarcerated in the country. Most people are incarcerated at the state court level. But there were efforts, and I think there have been recent efforts here in California, and this is a positive thing, to try and not incarcerate as many people. And that's a major influence in that is the cost. It's a burden for society to pay for the incarceration of so many people, and as I said, it has a destructive effect, particularly on certain communities. So I think that is the major area where costs could be addressed, and the public safety could be better served by using the money to try and get these people better. I don't know how to say, back into their communities in a more productive way and not so debilitated with civil disabilities that make them difficult for them to find work and be able to vote and reinstill themselves into the community in a productive way. But we have a very expensive system because of the number of people that we incarcerate.
Well, thank you, John. And I would add to that just the expense of the actual process as well. You know, just going through the system is expensive even prior to the incarceration. I would just add that to your comments. Well, both of you gentlemen, we are again nearing the end of our time, so I wanted to just take a moment to have you each highlight some of the things that you're currently working on that might be of interest to our audience. Patrick, I'll start with you. You are there at Cedarville University. You're the director of the criminal justice program there, and you're also widely active in the community, particularly in the law enforcement community and among the chiefs of police. Share with us a little bit about your current work before we close our program.
I'm doing workshops around the country on the recruitment, selection, and retention of law enforcement officers. I think that the quality of law enforcement is reduced down to the quality of people who are serving in law enforcement. And so, as I conduct these seminars, I try to get them to focus on hiring people that have high moral character, that are service-oriented, that are good with people, that are team players, that are performance-driven, and that can exercise self-control. So recruitment, selection, and retention of law enforcement officers is probably the primary thing that I continue to work, teach, and train on right now.
Right. Thank you so much, Patrick. And then, John, you are a defense lawyer in Southern California, and you're teaching also at the University of San Diego Law School on the death penalty. And I just wanted to have you share a little bit about some of your current work that might be of interest to our community.
Well, currently I'm doing the same thing I've done for the last almost 40 years, but I continue to teach a seminar on the death penalty at the University of San Diego School of Law. It's been a very enlightening experience for me. I think I get more out of it than the students do each year. I'm the criminal law advisor to the Mexican consulate here in San Diego, and I have a private practice. I defend people both in state and federal court charged with criminal offenses. So I have plenty on my plate and been doing the same thing I've been doing throughout my career.
And for the audience to know, defending a capital case is one of the more complex cases you can take on. So John's work is quite challenging, I'm sure, on all fronts, John. So thank you for that. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm so grateful that you are with us today for our Biblical Justice A to X conversation on criminal justice. I hope you'll join us again next month for our next video conference. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank John Cotsirilos and Patrick Oliver for joining us as our expert panel. And join us again next month. Thank you, gentlemen.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
And thank you to our audience. Good night.